whoever you are in Formula One, there are lots of other people there who are just as good as you are, whose sole object in life is to destroy you.
We are at war in that we're fighting for just one unique prize. It's a non-stop fight.
You need to have the best car, you need to have the best engineer, the best everything. If you don't have everything, you don't win.
This is an industry which is absurdly and obscenely awash with money.
It's not a prerequisite to be socially maladjusted to be a success in Formula One, but it probably gives you the edge over the next man.
Each year, 11 Formula One teams contest 17 races across 5 continents. This sport is a $3 billion a year industry. The competition is ferocious. The world's best engineers fight for an advantage that can be measured in just thousandths of a second. Formula One cars are designed and built to the limits of technology. Technology that is as secret as the most advanced military projects. Formula One's star drivers are global celebrities. The teams exploit their high profile to attract massive corporate sponsorship. The money they bring in gets devoured by the need to improve the cars from week to week. In this relentlessly competitive environment, nobody can afford to stand still. British teams have dominated Formula One for the last 40 years. The Italian Ferrari team is the only other to have any sustained success.
The intensity of Formula One is pretty close to warfare, technical warfare certainly. And the British mentality is better at Formula One than any other country in Europe. And that may very well be politically incorrect, but it's an absolute categorical, quantifiable fact. We just do it better.
But British teams haven't always done it better. No team can win Grand Prix races without discipline, money, and attention to detail. This harsh lesson was handed out by the great German teams of the 1930s. They brought professionalism to a sport that had previously attracted gentlemen amateurs. The Silver Arrows of Mercedes-Benz were the pride of Hitler's Germany.
Hitler was obsessed with demonstrating that the German nation was the best at everything, and he saw an opportunity to demonstrate how good German engineering, organisation and administration were by getting in on Grand Prix racing, as it was then, enabling Mercedes-Benz to produce extremely advanced motor cars by offering them considerable subsidies. I used to watch the Mercedes-Benz in 1937 and 38. And yes, it was gigantically spectacular. It was noisy, it was fast, it was dramatic, but it was not competitive. I mean, the Mercedes and Autos would finish 5 minutes ahead of everybody else. They were in a totally different league.
These Mercedes-Benz W154s crushed the opposition at the 1938 Tripoli Grand Prix, powered by supercharged 3-litre V12 engines. The success of Mercedes-Benz depended on the organisational genius of this man. With his trilby hat and lounge suit, team manager Alfred Neubauer cut an unmistakable figure in the pit lane. During the First World War, he'd organised the Austrian Army's new motorised artillery units. With the Silver Arrows, he perfected a system of hand and flag signals which allowed him to communicate information to his drivers during a race.
I think every team in Formula One learnt from what Mercedes did. They all really are very much like Mercedes were in the 30s, in that absolutely everything is accounted for, the risks are all reduced, everybody knows exactly their function. As you can tell from the pit stops, which are so brilliantly organised now. Mercedes invented that 70 years ago.
Neubauer watched as Hermann Lang's huge car was refuelled and made ready for new tyres. One of today's Silver Arrows, a McLaren Mercedes, stands still for just over 7 seconds. In 1938, it was all much slower. But with a lead of 13 minutes over the first of the Italian Alfa Romeos, Hermann Lang had time to spare. Even so, a rare mistake could have cost him the race. If not his life. Unfortunately for Mercedes-Benz and for the rest of Europe, Hitler's wider ambitions would put a halt to Grand Prix racing after the 1939 season. But not before the Silver Arrows had set the benchmark. The question would be whether anyone could match up to their standards. Before the Second World War, German teams had dominated Grand Prix racing. Mercedes-Benz, led by team manager Alfred Neubauer, had set the standards of professionalism that define today's Formula One teams. After the Second World War, with Germany in ruins, the British motor industry decided to assume the dominant position that Mercedes-Benz had once occupied.
The 1.5-litre BRM is not just a new British racing motor, it's the product of the combined effort of more than 160 British manufacturing firms, no expense being spared. The plan is to restore British racing prestige all over the world, and it's hoped that the new BRM will be in action during 1950.
The hugely ambitious BRM project was the brainchild of gentleman racer Raymond Mays. His inspiration came from Germany. As the war drew to a close, the Allies plundered Germany's technical expertise. While the Americans were employing German rocket scientists, the British decided to steal the German formula for Grand Prix success. In 1948, His Majesty's Stationery Office published a secret report, imaginatively entitled Investigation into the Development of German Grand Prix Racing Cars between 1934 and 1939. This would be the blueprint for the BRM. But the BRM would be a false start. Not surprisingly, it looked like a smaller version of the Mercedes W154. But with a 1.5-litre supercharged V16 engine, it was technically overcomplicated. To make matters worse, Raymond Mays was no Alfred Neubauer. The BRM project lacked focus and ultimately became a very public embarrassment.
BRM was run by people who really didn't understand that the imperative is to win races. Technically, they had some wonderful ideas. They built this technologically hugely sophisticated car that just sadly never worked.
The drama of the last-minute dash by air of the BRM car to enter for the international trophy race kept the big crowd at Silverstone in suspense up to the moment of starting. Alas for the hopes of its enthusiasts, the BRM failed to start owing to transmission trouble. 100,000 well-wishers were sadly disappointed.
Clearly, the British were bad at industry-sponsored motor racing. This would not be the way to win. 1954, Alfred Neubauer and his Mercedes-Benz team returned to Grand Prix racing. The Silver Arrows hadn't lost their secret ingredient. They were everything that BRM was not. Streamlined and ruthlessly efficient from the top down. The return of Mercedes-Benz was a symbol of hope for a new country, West Germany. Within just one season, the team again dominated motor racing. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . At the British Grand Prix in 1955, Mercedes-Benz took the first 4 places. Stirling Moss became the first Englishman to win his home race in the new era of Formula One. Neubauer's team again looked unstoppable. But once more, tragedy would end the team's dominance. Mercedes-Benz announced its withdrawal from all motorsport at the end of the season. Weeks earlier, the team had been stunned by the worst accident in the history of motor racing. At Le Mans' 24-hour sports car race, a Mercedes-Benz collided with a smaller car as it slowed into the pit lane. The Mercedes-Benz was sent flying into the crowd. More than 80 people were killed. Mercedes-Benz would not return to Grand Prix racing for more than 30 years. With the Germans gone, the Italians regained the dominant position they'd lost on Neubauer's return. Despite lacking the discipline of Mercedes-Benz, the Italians triumphed with brilliant lightweight engine designs.
The centre of the motor racing industry, manufacture, in the 1950s was Italy. And the reason was because that's where Maserati were, that's where Ferrari were, that's where Alfa Romeo were. And the notion of motor racing manufacture then and design was about the engine. The engine was the magic of any racing car. If you had predicted in the early 50s that Britain 10 years later would be beginning to emerge as the centre of the motor racing industry, you would have thought that was a completely absurd prediction, because at that point the industry was very weak in Britain and the centre of it was Italy.
The Italians would continue to win, concentrating their efforts on generating horsepower. So the British looked to new technologies.
Britain was a great centre of the aircraft industry, and the strength of that industry, coupled with its precipitous decline, meant that there were a lot of guys around with skills that no other European country had at that time. Lots of aerodynamicists, and some of those guys went into motor racing. And this gave Britain an enormous advantage over Italy, where there was really no, for example, aerospace skill base in that way. What mattered was the chassis and the aerodynamics, and the engine became, for a whole era, relatively secondary.
By the late 1960s, teams could buy reliable off-the-shelf engines from companies like Ford and gearboxes from Hewland. They reorganized these components so the engine was behind the driver. Their cars raced on disused World War II aerodromes. The great Enzo Ferrari derided the British teams with their new outlook, calling them garagistes, garage workers.
British manufacturers built small, light cars, usually borrowing engines. They built these light chassis that would work on smooth aerodrome circuits, unlike the German and Italian cars before the war and French cars, which were much more rugged and had raced on open roads. So we developed a new kind of racing car that was very, very suitable for the way that motor racing was going. So we, within 20 years of the end of the war, had absolutely the dominant influence on Formula One.
The 1960s were the heyday of the British garagiste. That decade, the teams won 8 Constructors' Championships.
It was a very much more informal, not to say shambolic business, a much more amateur business, and you could get by as a hustler. You didn't have to enter 2 cars. You didn't have to build the car yourself. If you could buy an old car and get hold of an engine and you'd got a driver, you could enter it and you could scrape together the entry fee, and you might do reasonably well.
One of the hustlers who forced his way into Formula One was a used car salesman called Frank Williams. Unlike most aspiring young racers, he hadn't been born into family money. In 1969, he scraped together the cash to enter a single car into Formula One.
I remember Frank Williams when his office was a telephone box. He hadn't got enough money to have a phone, and he would make calls to people, and then he would wait outside the telephone box for them to call back. So Frank knows the value of money.
His first driver was a personal friend, Old Etonian Piers Courage. Courage finished the 1969 season a respectable 8th in the Drivers' Championship. But the following year at the Dutch Grand Prix, disaster struck. Courage crashed. His car rolled over. He was trapped beneath it while it burned. Frank Williams was devastated by the loss of his friend, but he never gave up on his obsession.
I'm a racer, I've always enjoyed it. It's all I ever really think of. I've been a driver, I've been a mechanic, I'm now an entrant. I just enjoy it so much. It's part of my life, or it is my life, and I never have any difficulty in wanting to keep going, and I can't for the life of me imagine whatever else I would want to do anyway.
Over the following seasons, he would struggle, fielding second-rate drivers in third-rate cars.
He built a World Championship winning Formula One team out of what I can only describe as pit lane debris in the 1970s. He's worked for everything that he's achieved. Nothing has been delivered to him on a plate.
Frank, given his entrepreneurial instincts and his racer's instincts as well, thrived in that environment. Obviously, there were difficult years, living from hand to mouth.
But in the late 1970s, Frank Williams' fortunes would dramatically improve. He knew that the Saudi royal family might be interested in sponsoring a Formula One team. He learned that the king's second son, Prince Mohammed, was staying in London. He dumped that year's car in the bus lane outside the prince's hotel. The prince took a liking to the teetotal Frank Williams. Al Bilad, the prince's personal trading company, became a major sponsor. Frank Williams' other piece of good fortune was meeting a young engineer called Patrick Head. Head's technical skill perfectly complemented Williams' entrepreneurial flair. The two of them came to form a unique partnership.
I don't think I envisaged that designing race cars was an activity at which I could earn a useful living. I think I certainly had the idea that I wanted to work in motor racing, but I thought of it as an activity where I'd have to be scraping shekels from one day to the other, and I thought that it would be a limited time and that someday I'd have to go and get a proper job in engineering and design washing machines or something of productive use to mankind.
Well, until Patrick arrived, I was kind of muddled along and never achieved any success, just lots of failures that some people found rather funny, at least of all me. But it's been a very enjoyable partnership, I think, on a personal level. Too, we have some common interests, but the fundamental bond is this sport, is this Formula One.
Head designed the FW07, the first successful Williams car. It was solid, reliable, and totally pragmatic.
Right now, everyone's getting quicker and quicker. We've got to do the same. I put 2.5 more gallons in. You've got another 7 or 8 laps to go.
In 1979, after more than 100 attempts, Frank Williams won his first Grand Prix.
I don't know how many Grand Prix I'd participated in until that point, but I felt clearly very happy, but also rather very embarrassed how long it took to get there in the first place. It was a turning point in our fortunes.
The team now is a world away from the struggling outfit that Frank Williams started in the late 60s. Back then, he financed his ambitions by selling used car parts. Now, he sells advertising space. Today, his team isn't at Silverstone to go racing, nor even for testing. they're here to shoot a commercial. Compaq, one of the team's major sponsors, has just merged with Hewlett-Packard. Today, it's a secret. Tomorrow, the world will know.
The cars are mobile advertising hoardings, which command worldwide viewing figures of gigantic proportions. Billions with a B, billions of people watching it from March to November.
F1 has two audiences. One basically doesn't matter very much and the other matters a lot. The one that doesn't matter very much is the one that goes to the races. The one that matters a lot is the television audience, because that's what powers the money. And Formula One is about money. Big, big money.
350 million television viewers watch each Grand Prix. There are 17 races each year. This global exposure makes space on the cars a hugely valuable commodity, and Frank Williams knows how to sell.
I think probably for a man like Frank Williams, that's part of the fun. The deal-making, in a way, is another kind of competition. Nobody is better in Formula One at selling space on the car to sponsors. The tops of the suspension arms on a Williams are sold to a sponsor. You know, he's the only one who does that.
Sponsorship money has transformed Formula One. It started with Colin Chapman. He shocked the sport in 1968. The traditional green and yellow livery of his Lotus team was replaced with the red, white and gold of a cigarette brand.
Technology is expensive, so money had to be found from new sources rather than the traditional sources of the fuel, and oil and tyre companies, who hitherto had been the general funders of Formula One. Money is the common denominator in all success in many businesses and certainly in this sport.
Tobacco's billions would power Formula One throughout the 1970s and 80s. But now the party's over. Today seems like this a history. The teams recently bowed to government pressure and agreed to phase out all tobacco advertising by 2006. With his usual foresight, Frank Williams kicked the habit of a lifetime and gave up tobacco advertising before he was forced to. These days, he only deals with companies that can help him both financially and technically. Like all Formula One teams, Williams' finances are shrouded in secrecy. But it's thought that the team has an annual budget of $230 million. Half comes from BMW. Of BMW's contribution, $90 million comes in the form of 50 race engines and 150 rebuilt engines. Hewlett-Packard are thought to stump up $36 million, including a $1 million Alpha supercomputer. Allianz chip in with an estimated $1 million of insurance and $18 million in cash, while Castrol probably hand over $500,000 of oil and throw $8 million into the kitty. Michelin chip in with more than $4 million of tyres, while Petrobras serve up $2 million of free petrol each year, as well as handing over around $3 million in loose change. But there's no drinking and driving. The German beer company Veltins is the exception, offering no liquid support. They simply write a cheque in the region of $6 million. Before the cars became advertising hoardings, teams would race in their country's colours, the British in green, the Italians in red, and the Germans in silver. Grand Prix racing has been an outlet for national pride since before World War II.
You can regard the German government as the original major sponsor of Grand Prix racing and now Formula One. And it is now the big sponsors who are doing with money what Hitler did, except that they are doing it for commercial reasons and he was doing it for national reasons.
In the 21st century, European nations no longer go to war with one another. Today's wars are between multinational corporations, and Formula One is on the front line. Bringing in the sponsorship is a vital battle, but the real war is fought behind closed doors, in the secrecy of the team's headquarters. Deep in England's Oxfordshire countryside is this secret industrial complex. 450 people work here. Inside the Williams headquarters, some of the world's best engineers are busy spending nearly $250 million of sponsorship money.
A Formula One team will spend as much money as it can get. It can never get enough. But the sport is so technical these days that it requires vast amounts of money.
The technicians work punishing hours to improve the car's lap times by a few hundredths of a second. In this environment, EU directives on working hours go out the window.
Formula One is about hard work. It's about doing harder work than the guy next to you. You know, it's about Williams working harder than Ferrari. To get people that want to work in that environment, they find their way into the environment. It's very difficult to train people to want to do that. They come from racetracks all around the world in lower categories and they work their way into Formula One.
There's no time for socialising. It's flat out from dawn till dusk, and that's what wins you Grand Prix. That sort of horrifying level of commitment and intensity is what makes you better than the next man, I'm afraid, in this business.
It's 6:30 in the morning, but this car has already done several laps of Hockenheim in preparation for next week's German Grand Prix. It's being run on a 4-poster rig. The rig works off data that was recorded when a Williams previously did a test lap of the track in Germany. This data allows the engineer to subject the car to exactly the same bumping and jarring that it will experience when it returns to race.
We normally put the current car on the rig the week leading up to a race. So on the Monday, we would have a car on the rig with the data available for that track. And we would then start a sort of 2 or 3 day test program.
In the secrecy of the lab, the engineers can modify the dampers to fine-tune the car's suspension.
It's very important to optimise the damping on the car, to minimise tyre wear, to optimise the aerodynamics of the car, to make sure the car is always in the correct attitude to get the maximum out of the aerodynamics, and also to give the driver confidence in the handling.
Getting this right in Oxfordshire will save precious practice time over the race weekend. A 4-poster rig costs nearly $1 million. No Formula One team can seriously compete without one. A successful team also needs a Steve Berry. He makes exhaust pipes. He's done nothing else for the last 14 years. Each set costs $18,000. This is where the sponsorship money goes. And Steve Berry knows why.
Everybody remembers the winner. They don't remember who comes second or who comes third. In our company, the exhausts are classified as a Class A component. That means that if they break, it's a potential race-stopping occurrence. So we do our utmost to make sure that they don't break.
The best way to make sure they don't break is to make them out of Inconel. It's a nickel-chromium alloy that was originally developed by Rolls-Royce for jet engines. The exhausts are designed to work at temperatures up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. When the engine is idling, they glow red. At full throttle, they're translucent.
The material is only light because it's thin. It's a bitch of a material to work with. Because it's so tough, if you hit it, it will just come back to where it started. You try and bend it and you cut through the tube, it goes oval. You've got all sorts of problems on your hands just working the material. But if they haven't got my bit, they couldn't go racing.
British teams could never have triumphed without people like Steve Berry. Skilled artisans working with materials and ideas borrowed from the aviation industry have been the backbone of British success. Technical director Patrick Head has rooted the Williams team in this garagiste culture.
I think Williams has been successful over such a long period because basically Frank and Patrick are racers. They are creatures of motor racing. They both came up when British motor racing was a pretty primitive sort of affair, and they got their hands dirty, and they know it from the ground up, and they've never lost their appetite for racing.
Patrick's the best technical director in Formula One for the last 25 years, not by a little bit, but by miles, because he's very focused on good engineering, and it hurts him when they're not quickest. It's physical with Patrick. Williams it's an engineering company. It was not called Williams Grand Prix Engineering by accident. The main thing about Williams is the engineering.
I think Williams has always been very strongly engineering-led and has always put engineering and the quality of its cars as the top and most important thing, and providing it doesn't make the engineers big-headed and get above themselves, I think it's quite good.
The pace of Formula One is frenetic. Patrick Head's engineers have to improve the car every day or risk being left behind.
Fundamentally, Formula One is an R&D exercise. We're not in the business of producing tens or hundreds of motor cars. We're in the business of producing one prototype and making it better and better every day, every week, every year.
When a component is no longer cutting edge, it's instantly obsolete. There's no limit to how much effort can go into manufacturing the smallest part. The result is that each year 450 Williams employees make just 8 cars. In fact, the team doesn't make 8 whole cars. Williams produce the vast majority of the components, but BMW provide a 3-litre V10 engine. The brake pads and discs come from Carbon Industry, and the brake calipers and clutch from AP Racing. The wheels come from OZ, while the most secret and most important element comes from Michelin: the tyres. Formula One teams go to extraordinary lengths to produce the most competitive cars possible. But this key element is largely beyond their control. They don't even get to fit the tyres to the wheels. The tyre companies send their own staff to each race. The technology in a Formula One tyre is as advanced as any other component in the car. On a typical lap, the tyres revolve up to 50 times each second. Going round corners, they can experience lateral forces of 3.5 G. When the driver hits the brakes, they decelerate the car from just under 300 kilometers an hour to 80 kilometers an hour in just 2 seconds. The companies that know how to make a Formula One tyre jealously guard their knowledge.
The tyre is actually number one. A better set of tyres can give you a 2-second advantage, which is light years in Formula One when they're struggling to gain 1/10 of a second with a more powerful engine or better aerodynamics.
Tyres are so crucial because they're the bit of the car that touches the ground. They're entirely responsible for the transfer of all that technology on the car, all the things that make the power or the braking capacity of the car have an effect.
Tyres can determine a team's entire race strategy.
The tyre has got to last at least a third of the race on a 2-stop strategy, half the race if it's a 1-stop strategy. So what tyre manufacturers in Formula One are struggling for all the time is a tyre which gives the greatest grip and the longest life, and those two things are incompatible. So they've got to get the best possible compromise.
The tyre with the most grip is a completely smooth one, known as a slick. It provides the most grip because it has the greatest surface area of rubber in contact with the ground. It's banned. The treads on wet weather tyres disperse water, but serve no purpose in dry conditions. Now slicks are banned, tyres must have 4 grooves, reducing their contact area with the road. They work best at around 100 degrees Celsius, about the temperature of a freshly baked pizza. Tyre warmers, removed at the last possible moment, keep them hot and sticky. Tyres are often described as the black art of Formula One. Whatever the conditions, dry or wet, their importance can hardly be overstated. As far as Frank Williams is concerned, getting the right tyres is at least as important as signing a star driver.
Drivers, well, they're one of the 4 main performance requirements of a racing car. There's horsepower, there's the car, the aerodynamics of the car in particular, there is the driver, and there is the tyre. So he's 25% of the whole, if you wish. He is very important, and the FIS drivers command emphasises that.
Drivers to Williams are employees, highly paid, talented employees, but ultimately there to do a job, and if they don't deliver, they very rightly get quite a hard time. Racing drivers are big boys, they know what they're getting involved in, and if they come to the Williams team, they needn't expect any psychological life support systems out of the car, because they're not going to get them.
Drivers don't always find this attitude to their liking. More than once, Williams have allowed champion drivers to leave when their wage demands became excessive. In a sport typified by huge salaries and egos to match, there's nothing like a spell at Williams to bring a driver down to earth.
Williams is Patrick Head and Frank Williams. So if they hired Michael Schumacher, they would be hiring him as a racing driver. And they would not really want Michael to come in and say, I think we should have this engineer and this mechanic, and I don't want to work with this guy. And, they'd say, Michael, go away, let us do the job. Come, see you at the next test session.
It's a tough relationship. I repeat, they're very highly paid. They're great sportsmen, and indeed champions, many of them. And we expect almost perfection from them. Sometimes a little unforgivingly, but maybe that's a mistake, maybe it's a plus point.
Frank Williams is a frustrated racing driver. He would have admitted that 20 years ago. And the fact that he's got that innate competitiveness drives him to this very day. He is the ultimate racer's racer.
Frank Williams' frustrated ambitions nearly cost him his life. In March 1986, he attended a test session at the Paul Ricard circuit in the south of France. Afterwards, he set off in his hire car for Nice airport. He drove too fast.
The car took off, then landed nose down into a field, nose down, and somersaulted and came down upside down. And very sadly, the first impact when it came down was on Frank, more on Frank's side than on mine. And the roof caved in, and he took a direct blow basically on the top of his head, which basically moved the 4th and 5th vertebra sideways and crushed the spinal cord. And both of us were wearing belts. Neither of us had any other injury. I had no injuries at all, apart from bruising, and he had no other injuries, no other broken bones at all. It was just that direct blow on the head that did it. And the car was upside down. And in the end, I think an ambulance got there about 50 minutes later, but it was 50 minutes of me with Frank, and Frank being very logical and very calm in the way he was speaking and not panicking at any stage, talking about various things that he wanted done and this and that. And it was, it was very typical, really, of a Formula One person in a crisis. Very calm, very logical.
Frank Williams very nearly died. Not in a racing car, but in a hire car. The last rites were read to him by the side of the road. He survived, but was left permanently paralysed.
I think I was still young enough, and Frank was probably still young enough, where basically we thought we were indestructible, and as one does when one's younger, we weren't young, but we were certainly a lot younger. And the thought of Frank not running around in his running shorts and being physically a very dominant force in the team just hadn't occurred to me. I think we felt it was very important to keep, that Williams wouldn't collapse. I think for our own pride that year. We wanted to show that we could keep the show on the road and that we could do a very good job. And as it was, we won 9 races in that year, I think. We won the Constructors' Championship very easily, but we wanted to show that Williams was just stronger than the presence of one man, albeit that that one man, in effect, embodied the personality and the style of the team.
A year after breaking his neck, Frank Williams was back at work. In 1987, his first season back, his team won both the Constructors' and the Drivers' Championship.
Frank Williams is Formula One in many ways. There's no dwelling on past successes. Tomorrow's the most important thing in his life and always has been, and the next race after that. He is totally committed.
The year Frank Williams returned after his accident, something else happened that in the long run had an even greater impact on Formula One. Bernie Ecclestone, another used car salesman and friend of Frank Williams, became the vice president in charge of promotional affairs for the sport's governing body, the FIA. Soon, he'd become the most powerful man in the history of Formula One, and one of the richest men in Britain. Formula One is a never-ending battle for supremacy. The teams compete to get the most sponsorship, the best technology, the most championship points. And yet they're bound together by mutual self-interest. Their war, skillfully marketed, has made a lot of people extremely rich.
There are more millionaires per square yard in a Formula One paddock than anywhere else in the world.
It's not easy to gatecrash the party.
It's basically been the same guys running it for the last 20, 25 years, and they've got a system, and they've got a cake, and they've got the cake sliced up in nice segments, and they really go out of their way to make sure that those segments don't get any smaller, and that the cake remains as large and as rich as they can possibly make it.
You know, it's not a democracy. It's a community, but it's not a democracy. And the guy who really runs the sport is Bernie.
Let's get all the cars back into the pits and change tyres. All the cars back into the pits and change the tyres. Come on.
Formula One is run by one of the world's greatest salesmen, Bernie Ecclestone, who started off selling second-hand motorbikes and motor cars and has become such a fabulously rich man. I think a lot of people are intimidated by Bernie, there's no doubt about that, and I think that's how he's got his way.
Well, luck, you've got a discount because everyone gets good and bad luck. It's like playing roulette, you know? So I think you need to throw that away.
Soon after he bought the Brabham team in 1971, Bernie Ecclestone became secretary of the Formula One Constructors' Association, known as FOCA. The organisation had been set up to represent the British garagistes. Ecclestone bound the teams together against the bargaining power of the Continental Works teams. In 1978, he became chief executive of FOCA. 3 years later, after a turf war with the governing FIA, he gained the right to negotiate TV contracts. He tightened his grip on the sport in 1987 by becoming an FIA vice president. He recently secured the commercial rights to Formula One for the next 100 years. He shares the spoils with the team bosses. Exactly how the cake gets carved up is highly secret. Now, Bernie Ecclestone's entrepreneurial genius has enticed the world's most powerful companies onto his merry-go-round of money, publicity, and cutting-edge technology. Having succeeded in turning Formula One into a truly global product, he might have endangered the British garagiste culture that he set out to protect.
Nothing is forever. And I think that you can already see Britain's dominance, which at one stage was overwhelming, beginning to erode. What's happened now is that big manufacturers, car manufacturers, have moved into Formula One in a big way.
BMW is one of the biggest. The Bavarian giant joined forces with Williams in 1998. The company's 5-year commitment to Formula One won't leave it much change from $1 billion. Having made that kind of investment, the chances are that BMW will want to follow its rival Mercedes, and buy a permanent stake in a top Formula One team.
The centre of gravity is no longer in Britain like it used to be. And the money, which is coming from the big manufacturers, is in a sense dragging it geographically slowly to other places, to France, to Germany, to Japan.
It's not a natural situation, the position of cars being produced in England, and I would say it's quite heavily under threat at the moment. Nobody should sit comfortably thinking that Formula One exists in England and that we're the best at it.
I think that maybe what we should reflect on is that period from 1960 to, let's say, 2000 was a very exceptional period where Britain, this small area of Britain, was responsible for sort of 90% of motor racing cars. And that era is now being eroded. That era is over, and it's shifting to other places. How quickly and so on? Well, who knows? That's a question that one can only speculate about.